Hi everyone and welcome. We're out here in my garden, and what you see here is something we've been showing in my videos lately. It's my outdoor worm bin. And that worm bin wasn't always in that bag. In fact, I just recently moved the contents of that container out of that brown tub over there. And it was in that brown tub actually that I had originally launched my outdoor worm bin so that I could leave it out all winter to see how the worms do. And they did good. They were in that bin all winter long, and just more recently I had relocated them into here. And the reason I'm preparing this video is because it's now been 1 year since this outdoor worm bin was originally set up. So it was exactly 365 days ago, although technically since it's a leap year, tomorrow is the day that it's going to be the calendar day of its 1 year birthday. But 365 days, 366 days, in my book it's a year. And we're not really here to look at these two bins over here. The reason we're here is because in order for me to free up this brown tub for using it as my outdoor worm bin, I needed to first empty it. And what had been in that bin originally was what I refer to as my outdoor composting bin. This is my outdoor worm bin, and I have an outdoor composting bin, which is where all the stuff that doesn't make its way into the wormery goes, stuff that comes out of the garden, cuttings, pruning, everything goes into my outdoor composting bin if possible. And the container that I've been using most recently as my outdoor composting bin is the one you see right here. It does come up from time to time and people question what's going on with this bin. So we're going to poke around in this container to see what's going on in here. First things first, we're going to flip over the cover to make sure we don't have any hitchhikers hanging out. And right away we can already see some of the inhabitants of the bin over here. Other than those two worms, we got a little tiny baby pill bug over here, the roly-polie. I saw a couple other ones cruising around. And then something else that we could see already here stuck to the cardboard. It looks like it has passed on, but it's now being consumed by the mites that are cruising around it. That right there is something that I was unable to recognize 1 year ago. It turned out later I learned that this was a larvae of an insect known as a black soldier fly. And then I later learned that black soldier fly larvae are voracious composters. They eat and eat and eat, and they just do away with pretty much anything that you give them. Here we're seeing a couple other little tiny creatures in here. They're rolled up tight into these little, they almost look like a little seashell. And I'm not sure what they are. They might just be like a millipede or something like that. So it's kind of interesting. Just right away, without even going into the bin, we're seeing roly-polies. We're seeing whatever these are. We're seeing mites. We're seeing what's remaining of a black soldier fly larvae. And right here I see we've got a predatory insect, a centipede, probably looking to prey on some of the other creatures that live in this bin. But we're not here to look at a piece of cardboard. We're here to look at the contents of this bin. So let's open up. And another thing that I see in here often are all kinds of beetles. There's a cricket. I always find crickets in here lately, so they're probably coming in here to enjoy some of the yummy foods that are in here. And as you can see, there's all kinds of stuff in here. This is one of the tomatoes in my garden that just didn't make it. It recently started withering away, so I took it out and I threw it in here. See, I've got some larger items in here, and all kinds of leaves. I do throw in leaves once in a while just to make sure there's kind of a balance to the contents of the bin. Since it's mostly kitchen scraps that go in here, I try to balance it out with some carbon. So I'll throw leaves in here once in a while, since I know that the composters in this bin are probably also in need of some carbon, other than just the nitrogen-rich food that I give them. And the interesting thing is that as I rest my hand on here, I could feel heat emanating from this container. I wish I had a thermometer because it's really, really warm. And that's usually a good sign to tell you that there's black soldier fly larvae working in here, because they kick off a tremendous amount of heat. Another interesting thing that happens when they're consuming the food that you give them is that they barely leave behind any castings. Although they're not called castings. If you're thinking about the the waste product of a worm, those are castings. But if you think of a waste product of an insect, that's actually known as frass. So the frass that the black soldier fly larvae leave behind is very, very minimal, because they actually convert a huge amount of the food that they consume into body growth, so that they can get to the point where they can pupate and transform into a fly. So they're a very rapidly growing creature, and they're voracious eaters. Now I just spotted a much larger centipede ripping through here, real fast mover. But we're going to start poking around here to see what we can see. So like first thing I noticed over here after the centipede had caught my eye was a whole bunch of these little roly-polies. I think they're a really valuable contributor to the composting system in your bin, because they break down tougher materials that the worms have a hard time breaking down. So like if you have stuff like these peanut shells or chunks of wood, they really go crazy on that stuff, and that's probably why we're seeing a whole bunch of them piled up over here. So let's see if we can get a handful of this to get a better look at them. They're all over the place, lots of really, really tiny ones, a couple larger size ones. And I've often thought about just grabbing some from outside and bringing them into my indoor worm bins, because as far as I'm concerned, when I see them in my indoor worm bins, they're all welcome guests. But for whatever reason, this year I just don't seem to have many of them in my indoor worm bins. In fact, I haven't seen any. Now, when we grabbed that handful before, we actually did see a number of worms in here already. And the interesting thing about this container is that I've never actually added any worms to this bin, ever. Not even one. So all the worms that we're going to be seeing in here today are worms that have just kind of found this bin on their own and made their way into it. Cruised up out of the earth and made themselves at home in here. And there's so many of them, it's really quite interesting to see. So I'm really interested in checking out how my cantaloupes are doing, because last year I grew a couple cantaloupe plants, and they actually just popped out of the ground on their own. Their seeds must have been in my compost, and when I planted my garden, lo and behold, I had cantaloupes growing. And I let them go, but then I never really got good fruit off that plant. I really just ended up feeding those fruits to the worms in my basement. But I did have two cantaloupes, little ones, about the size of maybe a softball, that I had placed in my freezer last year, and I almost forgot about them. And the other day I was picking through and I found them, and I decided that since I wanted to shoot a video about this bin on its I guess its 1-year birthday as well, that I would throw those two cantaloupes in here so that we can check in on them a day later to see what kind of progress had been made. So I did not bury them very deep, so I'm hoping that we come across them soon. But I suppose there's always that possibility that maybe the the inhabitants of this bin have already eaten them up. And like I said earlier, the heat in here is quite intense. I can really feel the warmth. And it's because of these little guys. These are the black soldier fly larvae. And man, can these things compost. They just eat and eat and eat. And a lot of times I've actually considered setting up a black soldier fly composting bin, because that would be really interesting to see. But I've just never really followed through on the idea. Like down here, man, this material has got to be, I don't know, 115, 120 degrees in temperature. It's pretty impressive. And it's the black soldier fly larvae that kick off that heat. Just because they're eating and eating and eating and cruising around and climbing around through the container, and they just kick off all of this massive amount of heat while they're eating and digesting and moving around. So here's those two cantaloupes that I mentioned earlier. I wasn't quite sure what to expect when we get in here, because I'd only placed them in here a day ago. But I did sort of expect that it might be teeming with either worms or black soldier fly larvae, but it doesn't seem to be the case here. So it's a little bit of a disappointment. I did think that we'd see a lot more action around these two delicious food bits, but that doesn't seem to be the case. But nevertheless, it doesn't make this any less interesting. It's always fascinating to check out what's going on inside of this container, because it is just so different from what I'm used to seeing in my worm bins, in my wormery. And you saw the level of this bin. It's, you know, maybe halfway full, if that. And the interesting thing is that since I created this about a year ago, I did load it up with what had been in the brown tub and moved it over into this container. So it did not start out empty. It may have started out about quarter of the way full around this time last year, but over the course of an entire year, all of my garden scraps, all of my entire garden when I disassembled it last year, every bit of kitchen scrap that did not get fed to my worms in my wormery all went into here all year long. And the amazing thing about this container is that it just never gains any height. I can keep loading it up with fresh foods and it will just never ever fill up somehow, at least not in the summertime. I must say in the wintertime it did actually get pretty full, almost to the rim. But once the warm weather came in and the black soldier flies moved back in, the material just plummeted, and it has remained pretty low ever since then, because the black soldier fly larvae pretty much do away with anything that you give them. And they blend in pretty good, and you can only really see them if you grab a whole handful of the material and take a closer look. And it's also interesting sometimes because you peek in here and you'll just see a black soldier fly sitting there on the side of the container, and then you could reach in here, you could start rummaging around, you could be doing all kinds of stuff, practically, brushing up against the fly, and it just never leaves. They're very docile insects once they turn into a flying insect. Not like a housefly. A housefly, you can't get anywhere near that thing. It'll just take off in a moment. But the black soldier flies, they just hang out. They're very calm flying insects. So I'm so tempted to grab some of these isopods, or whatever they're called, these roly-polies. I feel like bringing some of them inside and adding them to my indoor worm bins, because they really do help a lot with the composting process. And they don't seem to overrun your bin either. They don't get into huge numbers the way mites might do if their conditions are ideal. The mite numbers can just explode in your indoor worm bin, but the isopods, they seem to remain in fairly normal numbers. And I also love the way they roll up into a ball when you disturb them. But they're all over the place. Anywhere you look, you see them all over the place within the bin. So I'm sure within a day or two this stuff is going to get discovered by the inhabitants of the bin, and they're just going to go crazy over that. I'm sure they're going to gobble it up 1, 2, 3 once they realize it's here. But like I said, I'm kind of surprised that they haven't really stumbled on it and started feeding on it yet. But it could just be because they're surrounded by all kinds of other delicious stuff that's perfectly edible. So now here's kind of what I was talking about earlier, is the worms. And it kind of makes sense to find the worms on the outskirts of the bin, because in the middle it's super hot in here, and worms don't really like it when it gets overly hot. So it makes sense that we're gonna end up finding them on the outskirts of the bin, because that's where it's a little bit cooler and a little bit more comfortable for them. But you can see they're in vast numbers in here. Huge numbers of worms. I'm assuming that they're red wigglers. And I never would have imagined that so many of them would just, on their own, make their way into my outdoor composting bin, but they have. Between them and the black soldier fly larvae, and all the other helpers in the bin, breaking down the materials in here, this stuff just gets gobbled up very quickly. And it was funny because somebody in one of the comments in one of my videos made a sort of a challenge to say, hey, when are you going to create a 10,000 population worm bin? And I told them that I believe I probably already have one, and it's probably this bin. Because other than all of the, you know, tremendous amounts of black soldier fly larvae that inhabit this bin, there's also a huge number of worms too. It just depends on where you look. And there they are. They're all working hand in hand right alongside each other, breaking down all of my scraps. So if you've ever wondered where all of the stuff that I don't put into my worm bins goes, it does not go in the trash. It goes in here. And for the most part, it gets broken down. And someday I'll have to go through this container to see what the end result was. See if I can get a sense of how usable the material in there is. Because there's a whole bunch of it. I'm sure it would do wonders for my garden. So I actually thought that maybe at the end of the season, once I take my garden apart, I could try to do a sort of a harvest on this container too, to see if I can pull out all of the castings and frass and all of the broken down compost that's in here and feed it to my garden. I'm sure it would do wonders. So this may be the most time that I ever actually spent looking around at the contents of this bin, and I'm glad I finally did it, because I'm always very curious about what's happening in here. If you've watched any of my other videos on my channel, you'll know that I often get sidetracked when I'm feeding my worms. I just end up picking around through the material and marveling at what the worms have done. And I could just kind of like spend all kinds of time picking through a container like this and looking at all the inhabitants of the bin and looking at what they do and how they work together. And it's almost like a little ecosystem of its own. It's quite fascinating, I think. So who knows, maybe in the future I can prepare more videos on how this bin is coming along. I just wasn't sure if, you know, since the primary audience of my channel is all about vermicomposting and composting with worms, I wasn't sure if people would be interested in a bin like this where it's not only worms but a whole bunch of other types of creatures working hard to break down this bounty of food that's been laid out for them. So, oops, I guess that's it for this glove. Just in time too, because I'm going to grab that cardboard we took off originally and cover this thing back up. Before we finish, let me also mention this, now that I can see a couple flies cruising around here. The interesting thing about the black soldier flies is that if house flies come in here and decide that they're going to lay their eggs in here too, because of all the yummy food supply, the black soldier fly larvae prey on the eggs of the house flies. So this becomes a place where the house flies all try to come and lay their eggs and try to create a little nursery out of this, but all the black soldier flies wipe them out. So basically they're an awesome pest control too, because they get rid of all the housefly larvae before they can hatch and become more flies. So that's another interesting tidbit too. I can get cleaned up here, you know, but that's not interesting. I won't bore you with that. Let me just take this as a chance to say thank you. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to my channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day.